Teach me something new. A command line trick, a random factoid, anything that's interesting to you. I've described this on HN before, forgive me if you've already seen it. I have chronic migraine. It sounds worse than it is. I rarely suffer attacks anymore, and when I do, they're usually mostly harmless, as in the case I'll describe below. Contrary to popular belief, migraine is not a headache. It's something a little more like an epileptic seizure. Intense headaches are one common symptom, but there are a lot of others. One common symptom of migraine is called scintillating scotoma. A scotoma is a blind or blank spot in the visual field. A scintillating scotoma caused by migraine is an area of the visual field that is temporarily replaced by a vivid visual aura. Its appearance is commonly the first symptom of a migraine attack, and is often followed by more unpleasant symptoms. I've seen scintillating scotoma many times over the years. A few years ago I was reading and enjoying a good book, and my scotoma appeared. It was a humdinger, roughly triangular prisms of white light with utterly black zebra stripes moving along them kaleidoscope style. It took up the lower left middle of my visual field, pulsing and radiating and turning, covering the book in my hand. I was disappointed. I didn't want to stop reading. I was enjoying the book. So I decided to keep reading until the scotoma made it impossible to continue. It never did. It became so vivid that I couldn't see my hand at all, but I still had no trouble reading the book. I even started reading it aloud without any difficulty. After a few minutes the scotoma faded. In that instance, it was not followed by any other symptoms. That's happened more and more frequently over the years, since probably my 40s. I could now see the book again, and could confirm that what I had been reading was indeed what was on the page. I thought about how to explain my experience. The best hypothesis I've come up with so far is that the neurological process of seeing and the neurological process of being consciously aware of what I'm seeing are not the same thing. They're independent processes. The scotoma prevented me from subjectively experiencing seeing the book, but did not prevent me from actually seeing it, nor from correctly interpreting what I was seeing. This experience, and 1-2 other odd experiences, has led me to adopt the working hypothesis that many of our cognitive experiences are more complicated than we tend to assume, and that they're often made up of several more or less independent processes. We usually benefit if related processes pretty much work together, so they pretty much do. Because they do, we experience them all together as a single experience, but that's an illusion that unravels if circumstances screw up their synchronization. I hope someone finds that as interesting as I do. I have experienced this several times and almost never have a headache. I definitely can't read what's beyond/obscured by the scotoma. The first time it happened was during a test in high school, and the splotch grew until I was forced to read the questions in my peripheral. I have an anecdote that corroborates your observation that cognitive experiences are more complicated than assumed. I was once very sleep deprived. I became aware that my body was reacting to something, as if there was a jump scare in a movie. I unconsciously flinched and pulled away from something without knowing why, and then a perceptual moment later, I heard a loud noise caused by something falling to the floor. There is a condition which manifests itself as complete blindness, but if you ask a person to try to guess what's in front of them, they usually guess correctly. Interesting? I get these scotomas about every 6 months or so, usually lasting for 30 or so minutes. I was told they were called ocular migraines, and a cursory glance over the internet doesn't seem to help me differentiate between the two, although I will say that 0 is a very accurate depiction of how it looks when it happens to me. I normally just take a break from whatever I'm doing and go for a walk. The first time it ever happened to me was the first day of a literature class that was an awkward event, explaining to my teacher that I couldn't read at the moment. 0? Greater than I thought about how to explain my experience. The best hypothesis I've come up with so far is that the neurological process of seeing and the neurological process of being consciously aware of what I'm seeing are not the same thing. They're independent processes. The scotoma prevented me from subjectively experiencing seeing the book, but did not prevent me from actually seeing it, nor from correctly interpreting what I was seeing. This sounds similar to the phenomenon of blind sight. Greater than they're often made up of several more or less independent processes. I've recently read 1,000 Brains, a new theory of intelligence by Jeff Hawkins, and that is essentially what he argues. That our neocortex had consists of millions of a similar structure and many of them fire up at the same time. Fascinating book, would highly recommend. I've never experienced what you have, but it's fascinating. Our cognitive experiences are more complicated than we tend to assume. I arrived at the same conclusion from different experiences. In my late teens and early 20s I worked for several years as a professional magician doing close-up sleight-of-hand magic in nightclubs, restaurants, bars, parties, trade shows and corporate events. I performed for a lot of different types of people in different contexts and noticed how people would describe an effect they'd just seen me do to a friend who didn't see it. Their memory of something they'd just seen moments before was substantially different than what had actually happened. This is unsurprising because my performance was carefully designed and rehearsed to create that misperception. What is surprising was the extreme detail and certainty of erroneous perceptions even from highly intelligent expert observers who were 100% focused on my every action with maximum effort. I found this super interesting and spent quite a bit of time exploring it with various experiments and pondering the implications, which led me to the same realization you had about our conscious perceptions being less accurate and more variable than we internally experience them to be. In short, our memories can seem like a video recording to us, but that's just a very convincing self-illusion. In recent decades, psychologists like Richard Wiseman have published research documenting this. I'd recommend the book The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat by Oliver Sacks, which I seem to remember digs into some phenomenon like these. There are very interesting differences between certain lesions in the left side of the brain, and in the right side. For instance, there are some people that are blind, but do not believe that they are, and vice versa, which lines up with your experience. So really out there, but I've just watched your Lie in April anime and the piano artist has some kind of anxiety attacks while playing the piano, and the symptoms are very similar to what you describe. Suddenly things turn grey underwater like and start turning, and his view/hearing of what he's playing disappear. See minimum 132 here. I couldn't find any illness associated to the condition of not being able to hear yourself/the notes disappearing while playing, but what you are describing, losing yourself while reading as the world closes around the words in a kaleidoscope-style prism, sounds really similar. As someone with epilepsy, the divorce between what my body is doing/experiencing and what my brain perceives or is asking for are precisely how you describe it. It leads to a lot of out-of-body experiences and dissociation. As a weird side effect, I also mostly only have lucid dreams now. One thing I found odd is that there's entire groups of people who chase this kind of mental state. Usually through a state of psychedelic drugs to induce a state of altered mind. It's really odd to me because I hate the feeling myself, being forced into it. Though I suppose it's like anything, where if it's in small doses it's a fun novelty for some. Anyway, my epilepsy has greatly affected my perception of my own perception abilities. A simple demonstration of how complex our eyesight is: put your hand between your eyes, touching your nose, and compare what you see with the left eye closed and the right eye closed. On one side, knuckles; on the other, the palm. Yet when you open your eyes, your brain seamlessly fuses the images together and makes your hand largely disappear. I have migraines fairly often and had a similar experience during a job interview. It was bizarre and troubling because at first I thought it was a floater, then I realized it was in the same place in both eyes. It grew over the course of a few minutes until it completely surrounded my visual field, then it faded away. It's fascinating that you were still able to read without seeing. I've had migraines about every 2 months for the past 12 years, and with very few exceptions they've always followed the same pattern: 30 minutes of scotoma, small to large to small, 30 minutes of peace, then a strong headache for about an hour. I usually still have a mild headache the next day. I've had the migraines mostly while sitting at the computer or reading, but it seemed impossible to me to continue to read since the zigzags were right above the letters, and frankly quite distracting. Because of that, I've never really tried to continue. It seems weird to say that, but I'm almost looking forward to the next migraine solely to test if I can still read if I really try. That would be awesome. Thank you for your description. I've also suffered from what I've understood to be ocular migraines, characterized by the intense ocular disruptions. I went to the ER when the first one hit, because I thought I was going blind. It was disappointed. I didn't want to stop reading. I was enjoying the book. So I decided to keep reading until the scotoma made it impossible to continue. I do the same thing now. I had one come on recently when I was lifting weights. I just decided to power through it. It was perhaps the most intense oral disruption I've experienced, but the typical after effects, which in my case, tend to be very bad and render me useless for 2 to 4 hours following an attack, were almost completely subdued. I recall that I felt like I had a slight hangover and was able to fully function after it passed. Generally speaking, scintillating scotomas don't fill the entire field of vision. They can do, and when they're caused by migraine auras they tend to grow and then shrink again within a 20 to 60 minute window. I can certainly read when I'm experiencing one. I can continue to work if I really want to, but I find that having a coffee and taking a break is much more comfortable. Migraine auras suck, but are pretty fascinating. Depending on which part of the brain they affect, different symptoms can manifest. Visual auras a la scintillating scotoma are probably the most common, but slurred speech can happen as well, or reduced sensation in half the body, probably other things as well. Very interesting. About 8 years ago, I had many migraines, a few per year, but I would essentially be unable to do anything for a couple of hours. Many of those were the results of being in a noisy environment or high physical effort. I knew whenever I was going to get a migraine because I got the auras, couldn't see in front of me, but if I remember correctly I still had my peripheral vision, and couldn't feel the very tip of my thumbs and my tongue. Yes, apparently you can lose this too. A few minutes after those feelings, sure enough I would get the migraine. When in that state, I have a big headache, can't see much, nausea. Hopefully other people will relate. A scotoma is a blind or blank spot in the visual field. Oh, I've had those, though not as lasting or opaque as they sound for you. I always thought it was one step prior to the blinding pain level I'll get from different nerve compression syndromes and injuries I have/had. For obvious reasons I try to manage my life to limit agitating the nerves, and to not reach the blinding pain level, where for at least a few moments I can't see or don't experience anything but the pain, quite the short-circuit mechanism to grab one's full attention. Thank you for teaching me something new. I used to get these more frequently, but just had one last week for the first time in ages. Mine look quite a bit like zero, and I never knew what they were or that they had a name. Mine used to happen a bit when playing sports, so I always associated them with dehydration, but it seems like that's probably not it. Zero? Greater than has led me to adopt the working hypothesis that many of our cognitive experiences are more complicated than we tend to assume, and that they're often made up of several more or less independent processes. After finishing my comp sci degree I was bored and did some first-year psychology degree courses, and that was also one of my main takeaways. I don't mean it was an original take, just one of the main takeaways I remember from these courses. See for example split brain individuals 0, where the connection between the two hemispheres is severed/damaged. Up to a point this was a common surgery to treat epilepsy a decade ago. Patients seemed fine on first glance, but ultimately there were interesting incongruences. 1. I'm probably doing injustice to the description of the experiment, so please read the linked page, but essentially they created a situation where each eye saw a different image, for example one related to chickens and another to snow, and then asked to choose with different hands from a set of pictures the picture most related, for example an egg or a snowman. The right hand, connected to the right hemisphere and thus the left eye, chose one thing connected to what the left eye saw, and the right hand chose another. Let's say the left eye saw snow and the right saw chickens. The most interesting part is when the patients were asked about their choices, since only the left hemisphere can talk, the speech center. So they explained why the left hand chose something correctly, but made up some unrelated explanation about their right hand choices. Eggs are white like snow. In other more horrific terms, the right hemisphere had some level of thinking/reasoning going on but could not speak since it now had no mouth. So, in healthy individuals there's definitely syncing between the two hemispheres and different centers going on, but as any complex system I'm sure there are hiccups. 0? 1. You can find some kind of experimental evidence for your hypothesis that the neurological process of seeing and the neurological process of being consciously aware of what I'm seeing are not the same thing in this book, Phantoms in the Brain, Probing the Mysteries of the Human Mind by Ramachandran, Blakesley. I have struggled explaining what the auras looks like, but for me they look like confetti, in particular the shiny stuff used to celebrate sports championships. Sorry for piggybacking on your fascinating account, but unless you experience it yourself, it is hard for non-affected people to imagine what it looks like. Yes, there are many levels of perception. There is also blind sight. This can be studied by looking at what happens in neurological disorders like yours and more severe ones. Read the book The Man Who Mistook His Wife by Oliver Sacks if you find this kind of stuff interesting. Read a fantastic book that makes the case for composite cognitive processes called Self Comes to Mind. It touches upon the composite nature of sight, and other senses and functions. Its ultimate goal is putting forth a theory of how self naturally arises from the composite. I did find this very interesting. When you experienced the scotoma, was that combined with pain by the eyes? I get migraines from time to time, but could never imagine pushing through the inability to focus my eyes because it usually comes with pain/nausea. I suffer from migraines from time to time. Over the years I've found that some foods can trigger them, for example plant oils. I eat salad with olive oil and half an hour later I start getting these headaches that start at the eyes. I'm sorry that you experience migraines. I have only experienced one in my life during a stressful stint in graduate school. I lost, temporarily, the connection between what I wanted to say and the words that would come out. It was crazy. Steven Pinker in How the Mind Works describes a bunch of phenomena that uncover how the brain is structured and how it processes information. The book doesn't quite have a lot of detail, but is pretty interesting nonetheless. Take some acid, and what you are describing regarding consciousness becomes fairly apparent. The amount of things that automatically happen or get filled in for us goes unnoticed until you get a chance to step outside of it for a while. These are called ocular migraines. I've had them since a kid, roughly once every 2 months or so. What's really interesting is after having heart surgery, I would have like 10 a day for weeks. Others in post-cardiac surgery message boards reported the same experience. It went back to normal frequency months after surgery, but definitely an unsolved mystery. I used to suffer from these auras from 2005 to 2015. I never had one before, and they completely disappeared since then. I don't think they were ever followed by any headache, either. A funny but related story, I was visiting Paralimonial where there's a diorama about the visions of Saint Margaret Mary, who is at the origin of the current cult of the Sacred Heart of Jesus. In fact, from the descriptions, it's very clear that the brilliant, shimmering lights that she related as her visions and revelations of the Sacred Heart were simply scintillating scotoma from her migraine, then followed with terrible access of headaches that she interpreted as her mystical ordeal from God. I had similar experiences beginning a few weeks after a mild tear in the lower right part of my cerebellum in 2002. But it manifests itself slightly different. My whole field of view, both eyes, disintegrates into something of a mix like A or one side of an unsolved, scrambled into about 250 to 400 fields. Not quadratic, and not regular in a geometric way, more like leaves, roughly the shape of A. It starts as something like a fast within about a second, 2 at most, and then I'm having this screensaver effect for about 30 seconds to a minute, or so. Most fields are just scrambled into random positions, sometimes even jumping into others, while about a few dozen are impossible blacks or greys with vertigo-inducing feelings, because they seem to jump back and forth between infinity and back. Really hard to describe. Anyways, this absolutely messes with my orientation, and I shiver or even shake slightly. However, I do not fall. One time this happened to me while carrying a cup of coffee on a saucer from the coffee machine in a conference room back to my seat. The cup clattered on the saucer because of my shaking, but I managed to put it down on the next table with a loud clack, and drop myself into some spare chair next to the wall, without spilling a single drop. Witnesses described my moves as something like an industrial robot on fast forward. Not fluent, but in fast and small consecutive steps. But I couldn't see. Haven't had one of those for years now, also no debilitating pains, those came first. Thing is, I mostly had these when I felt under time pressure, stressed, angry. I think. For instance, bicycling fast somewhere to be there as arranged. Happened several times, full break. Bicycling fast, really pushing it, but just for fun. Never happened. So far really, really strange. Funny thing is, MRIs decades later show nothing. According to the radio and neurologists, there aren't even traces of something bad, and my brain has exceptionally good blood circulation. Oh, back to language. At the time this happened I had trouble speaking in several ways. First, to find words, then to form/speak them. But only in German, which is my native language. Not so in English. Also I didn't really notice it at first, because I tend to not think in words, but mostly visual in pictures, movies, abstract mashups of these. I also had ataxia, but not one-sided as usual, but right arm, and left leg. Really, really strange. But mostly gone now. Except for losing temper fast. That stayed. Can't have a better defense against BS though. Smile? In the 1800s, scholars who knew a lot of languages, including, often, several modern and ancient European languages, and increasingly also Sanskrit, started to notice some amazing patterns about similarities in words among all of these languages, including languages from very far apart and that had no visible connection at all from the point of view of their present-day speakers. As these patterns were explored, they were found to be even more systematic and pervasive than they had appeared. In some cases, one sound would systematically change into another sound from language A to language B. These patterns helped reveal historical connections between most languages of Europe, Central Asia, and South Asia, showing that those languages had descended from the same ancient sources. Note that this isn't true of 100% of languages in this region. There are other unrelated families that turned up, but it's true of a significant majority. The languages that turned out to be related this way included the Germanic family, like German, English, Dutch, and the Scandinavian languages, the Romance family, like French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, and Catalan, the Celtic family, like Irish and Welsh, the Slavic family, like Russian, Bulgarian, and Ukrainian, and also Farsi and all the Central Asian languages related to it, and Hindi/Urdu, and all the South Asian languages related to it. Oh, and Greek. If I tried to list all the languages and language families that were linked up to this family tree, we would probably be here all day, because they go on and on. Just under half the people in the whole world have one or another of them as a native language today. These languages changed quickly enough in history that most people no longer noticed, or remembered, that most of them were related to one another, yet slowly enough that it's been feasible to deduce an enormous amount of information about the history of particular languages and particular words, once many of the rules and patterns had been identified. A Grimm's Law example is that the H sound in Germanic languages usually corresponds to the K sound in Romance languages. Note that this can be stated much more technically and accurately. So, it turns out that hundred and cent, cento, centum actually share the same origin. And heart and cur, corazon, kappa alpha rho delta alpha, origin of cardiac, also cordial, the root in Latin sounds like cord. And who and k, qua, key, and similarly for other WH questions in English and ku questions in Romance, which were originally HW sounds in English and KW sounds in Latin. Some other examples are T to D, ten and decim, dies, des, plus some of the examples above that have a T in English, and F to P, foot, and the Latin and Greek words from which we get pedestrian and podiatrist, and Romance pied, pie, pay, and don't forget about father and padre, pater slash. Those are just a couple of the phenomena that people noticed in the 1800s. While the exact development of these patterns gets much more complicated, they've proven to work over and over and over, for hundreds of languages and hundreds of thousands of words. Also, the Grimm from Grimm's Law is one of the brothers Grimm, from Grimm's fairy tales. On this general topic, I recently learned that the words undulate and water have the same origin in Proto-Indo-European word, pie, udor, Proto-Italic, under, Latin, undulatis, late Latin, undulate, English. Wodra, pa, waiter, Proto-Germanic, watar, Proto-West Germanic, wetter, Old English, water, Middle English, water, English. In fact, I'm now noticing that the T in the Proto-Germanic line corresponds to the D in the Proto-Italic line, just as you said. And a search for the roots of said shared terms creates trees of relations which are crucial and incommensurately important to recognize clusters of meanings that link disparate terminal terms, and arrive to patterns in this compositional structure that are the heart and soul of those clusters. For example, I recently mentioned in these pages the terms for the sky as spawning from ideas of covering, which also spawn terms for color and concealing. Greater than the languages that turned out to be related this way included. I see you have left out no less than Italian, the post-Latin at the epicenter. OT, BTW, Seth, thank you for Let's Encrypt. Maybe this is also something that OP did not know. I've always found it interesting that some words are constructed the same across many languages. For example, response, responsibility in English, well. Russian. German, Antwort, for Antwortung. Scandinavian, Svar, Ansvar. There's likely more. Even though the modern words have diverged completely, the concept behind the construct is the same. The Swedish/Scandinavian word for human människa has 3 syllables, Norwegian menneske sounds more like 2 syllables, as opposed to German Mensch. It sounds suspiciously similar to the Sanskrit word manusha, which apparently also means human. In drug development, a lot of the engineering goes into making sure the pharmaceutical compound, having been developed, actually reaches the target area of the body. If the compound is a relatively large particle that needs to get into the bloodstream, a nasal spray might result in the compound being deposited at the bottom of a person's lungs without ever getting absorbed. If stomach acids break the chemical down, then digestion might not be a feasible approach. Intravenous might work, but shots are scary, or worse, the medication may need to be administered in low doses over a long period of time, requiring an 4 catheter. For a pill that can be digested, often it will be the case that the pharmaceutical compound needs a lot of buffer space, sugar or something else to prevent it from being absorbed too quickly. So if a pill says do not break in half or do not chew, this is because doing these things increased the pill's surface area, and the rate that the drug gets absorbed, when optimal rate of absorption has already been calculated. When I was researching my kid's ADHD medicine, I was fascinated to learn about its osmotic release delivery system. Looks like a simple pill is actually a tiny machine that delivers the medicine at a precisely controlled rate over a period of hours. Greater than a nasal spray might result in the compound being deposited at the bottom of a person's lungs without ever getting absorbed. Is it also true for cocaine and other similarly ingested substances? Are coke users walking around with garbage in their lungs? Harmonicas are amazing instruments. At first people assume them to be like toys. You can buy really cheap ones everywhere, and initially the concept seems really easy. 10 holes, drawing air produces some notes and blowing air produces other notes. But the more you get into it, the more amazing it gets. Soon you discover that you can bend notes by positioning your tongue in a specific way, and your repertoire increases tremendously. You learn about overbending, tongue blocking, the wah-wah sound you make covering the flow of the air with your hand rhythmically. Don't remember if that has a name. I knew very little about music when I decided to play the harmonica. I looked for an instrument that required little maintenance, were easy to transport and easy to play everywhere. So I decided to learn to play the harmonica by myself. It's easy to start with it, but it gets challenging when you try to learn those techniques, mostly because you can't see inside people's mouths to see what they are doing, and you aren't used to force your tongue to do those specific movements. When you see what people can do with it, it can be jaw-dropping. I'm still a beginner at it, but it's so rewarding after practicing a lot to get your first bending, to reproduce songs you have learned just by muscle memory, to sound a little bit closer to those blues masters. Definitely something worth to try in my opinion. Fabulous addition. For anyone looking to see what a master harmonica player looks like, highly recommend looking up Blues Traveler, John Popper. In particular, there's a live performance of No Woman No Cry that has John Popper alongside Ziggy Marley. Mind-blowing. Watch it. You won't regret it. After reading your comment and its replies, I went looking on YouTube for some harmonica videos. I don't play the harmonica, and I don't have any idea about music. However, I do like the harmonica as an instrument whenever I hear it in some songs. I find that usually the harmonica always plays multiple notes together, and to my untrained ears, this always makes me feel that it can never hold the stage like maybe a saxophone can. Then I came across the video below, and honestly, I was extremely impressed. It felt as if each note was being played by itself, and the artist had complete control over the instrument. Editing to add. The artist, Indiara Sphere, also has a complete course on her website. Ordering a typical printed circuit board with components placed on it is so cheap nowadays that this is a viable option for electronic hobbyists nowadays. For example, just ordered 50 pieces of audio output amplifiers at €3.49 per piece, customs and shipping included, where €1.60 would be the parts cost of the 2 chips on it. Only thing you need for this is 1. An idea and some knowledge about electronics. 2. An ADA software where you design the schematic and the PCB, Horizon ADA, KiCad, Eagle. This software will give you the Gerber files needed to manufacture the PCBs and the BOM, bill of materials, and a pick-and-place file, which is basically just a CSV telling the manufacturer which part goes where and in which orientation. 3. Using the BOM you find corresponding parts the manufacturer has and create a CSV that matches their format requirements. 4. You order, for example I ordered at JCB PCB. The electronics knowledge is the hardest part. Story time: back when I was in school, our introductory electronics class had us make a PCB for a PI microprogrammer on our first day. We got a handout of the schematics. We had to transfer its negative to a copper-coated plate using some chemical, used UV light to fixate it, then dissolved the rest of the copper in acid. Finally we got to drill the holes for through-hole soldering points. Next class we soldered all components. And by the end of 2 classes, everyone had their own functioning, or not, programmer, which we used the rest of the year on a variety of electronics projects. Great fun! This is 100% accurate and I recommend it. I know that most people reading this right now will say this is so hard I don't even know where to begin, but, as with anything, once you know how it's done, it's trivial. The parent comment is a good introduction. Watch some KiCad videos on designing circuits. The process is pretty foolproof if you design the schematic correctly, and then you basically export gearbus, upload them to the fab, JLC PCB, and you have PCBs in a few days. Here's a small PCB I designed, together with KiCad project files that will error check and export the gearbus automatically. Install Run KiCad in the directory of the designs, and you'll get files that are ready to upload to JLC PCB. Edit the designs etc. to make your own thing, that should help you get started. I find this to be amazing. I last designed a single-layer PCB for an industrial control application, in the 1990s, using OrCAD for the schematic, and a paint program to lay out the PCB. Needless to say, I look forward to KiCad and just having something show up at my door. Now all I need is an idea worth spending the money on. 8. Out of all the hobbies I've had, electronics, mostly something to do with the ESP microcontrollers, is the most satisfying one once everything works as intended. While electronics knowledge is hard to learn on your own, in my case, there are tons of communities online that are more than willing to help. One of YC startups JIT is trying to automate the electronics design part with AI. The company is using a new LB Stanza programming language created as one of the co-founders' PhD thesis. 1. I watched a piano/music teaching video from the 60s yesterday that made it all click. 1. Most modern music chords patterns are easy to find out on piano. Start on any of the white keys, and play 7 white keys left to right. That is called a mode, a series of notes separated by certain intervals to compose a song. Different modes have different vibes. Atmosphere of the song, sad or happy, is directly correlated by how willing the notes are to resolve to the mode root, the first key of 7 you hit. Now, take a 1-3-5 grip on the white keys, press 1 key, skip 1, press 1, skip 1, press 1. That is called the first chord. Move 1 to the right, and do it again. That is the second chord. 1 more to the right is the third, etc. Most popular songs are composed by using mostly the same repeating chord patterns. 1-5-1-4, first, fifth, first, fourth. 1-4-5. 1-5-6-4. If you experiment a little bit with this, you will instantly recognize a lot of songs, although they might be pitched higher or lower. One step further is learning different chord fingerings. We started with 1-3-5, which mostly results in a major or minor chord in a mode. Fifth chords are 1 to 5. Seventh chords are 1-3-5-7. Sus2 is 1-2-5. Sus4 is 1-4-5. Etc. Now, the next thing you need to learn is to transpose, move songs up or down 1 or more keys to the left or right, but also taking into account the black keys when moving up/down. This will allow you to play along with a song in the perfect key, starting note of a scale. There's other things, like modulating modes in songs, but this should give you a head start. 1. Edit, layout and some extra clarification. Ever since I learned that the frequency ratio between adjacent keys on a piano is always a constant 12th root of 2 regardless of whether you're going black-white or white-white, I've been sort of frustrated with the way pianos are designed. Transposing a song to a different key could have been effortless if keys were structured differently, such as with uniformly alternating white and black keys, rather than the 2 black 3 black groups we have now. By optimizing pianos for C major, A minor, we've made everything else so much more difficult. And no other instrument does this as far as I know. String instruments don't obscure the constant ratios at all, so it's easy to transpose songs on them. I suspect someone may reply to this with it'd be harder to keep track of what notes you're on if keys were uniform like that, but I don't think we actually rely on feeling the keys to know where we are. Would be willing to be proven wrong on that. But I suspect simply coloring/shading each fifth and octave differently should do the job, maybe also texturing them differently for the blind.
Hey guys, this is the Rogue YouTuber here. I recently had a big change in my life. I had a baby daughter. Here she is. If you could do me a favor and remember to hit the subscribe button and bang the bell, I'm hoping to really create a YouTube channel that really gets people excited and brings people the best, most interesting content collated from across the internet. I'm saving up to save my little girl to Carnegie Mellon Computer Science Department. So please remember to like and subscribe. See you next time.